Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. Last week, or possibly the week before, depends on what order I put these videos up in, we had a look at what's in the Lowride Pumpkin box. This week we're going to start the build. Right, first we need to get a couple of bits ready. We need a big screwdriver, a small screwdriver, some cutters. Now side cutters are best, but the edges on mine are so bad they won't cut plastic anymore. Need to get some new ones. We're also going to need a couple of knife blades too. For electronics we'll need an ESC. Now normally the kit comes with a Tamiya one, but I got one without. Saved a couple of quid and the difference paid for a set of bearings. And we need a receiver, and I'm just going to use a nice cheap FlySky one. And of course we're going to need a steering servo. Now this one's metal geared and high torque, way over the top for this model, and it does have a bit of a dead band in the travel, so we'll probably swap that out at some point for one with a bit more precision. On top of that we'll need some paint. Tamiya if you want to be posh, or Halford's best if you want to have some left over when you're done. Oh, and of course we're going to need a battery. The MO6 will take a hard case LiPo quite nicely, but I'm going to be using a 6L NiMi for now. This one's got a Dean's connector, but you get the idea. The kit also comes with a little cross wrench, an Allen key for the pinion, and some grease. We've got the nice little comic warnings on the other page, and some diagrams for Tamiya electronics which appear to be on 27 megs. Time for an update maybe. Anyway, that all brings us to step 1. Like most Tamiya kits, the build is split up by the metal parts bags, starting with bag A. In the big bag of bits we've got all the small parts bags. There's some other odds and ends too, but it will be pretty obvious when we need them. In the small bags there's usually some smaller bags inside. To keep everything safe it's good to have some pots on hand. These ones are Auntie's steam pudding pots. Probably golden syrup. They're pretty good and have really long use by dates. The screws get emptied into the pots and the other bits from the bags will be okay off to the side. One more thing before we really get into the build. If you've built a kit before you'll probably know all this, even an Airfix kit or something along those lines. The plastic parts are labelled with a letter and a number. The letter tells you which parts tree you want. We want A11, so here we have tree A, and you can just about see the little tab with an 11 on. All the parts on the trees are labelled like this, so as long as you always match up the part numbers everything will go together nicely. Cutting the parts from the tree we want to get a nice flat edge. Bending the parts back and forth will completely destroy the edge. Cutting with some cutters does the job, but you have to trim the remaining nubs off with a knife, otherwise they're going to get in the way. The best tools are side cutters. You can usually get a nice clean cut that will do the job straight away. Okay, we've got the rear section of the chassis. We'll also need E6 and a pair of C11s and C19s to make up the arms. From the metal parts we'll need two 46mm screw pins. The parts on the side are drawn to scale. If a part matches, you're good to go. Lastly, we need 5 10mm self-tappers. Watch out as there's some 12mm ones too. It's easy to get the wrong ones if you're not paying attention. And that's about it for all that, so let's actually start building. The rear arms are 2 pieces. Each part has a mark on one end, just make sure they all match up. When they do, the 2 parts should slide together nicely. Each of the arms needs 2 of the self-tappers. Be careful not to over tighten them, the plastic's quite soft, so take it easy. Make 2 of the arms and install them on the chassis. Use a screw pin and do them up. Again, don't go nuts tightening them up, they only need to be tight enough that they're not going to fall out. E6 sits up on top. It will end up being the mounting point for the shock towers, among other things. It only needs the one self-tapper in the middle. Most of the bits on this kit have nice little bulges to keep everything located nicely. It makes it quite a bit easier to line everything up. Great stuff. And there we go then, that's step 1, the rear lower arms. Step 2, the classic Tamiya differential. Used in lots of kits, it's robust, easy to assemble, and they seem to last forever. We need the gears we set aside earlier, 2 steel shims, 3 small self-tappers, the diff case, grease, and we're going to need the diff cover too, which I forgot to take out of the gear bag with the case. The tube of grease comes sealed, so we need to poke something pointy in the end of it. Sometimes there's a little bit of internal pressure, so it might ooze a bit. I keep the tube in a plastic pot during assembly to avoid seepage on the bench. Okay, we take one of the big gears and a shim, apply some grease around the base of the gear and fit the shim. Drop the gear into the diff case, making sure it's nicely seated. Next, take what Tamiya like to call the star shaft. Pop a blob of grease on the ends and spin on a gear. The third one can be a bit tricky. The assembly fits into the diff case with the ends of the shafts fitting into the slots. A pair of tweezers makes life a lot easier, but some pliers will do the job too. Push it all the way down so the gears are nicely meshed with the bevel gear. Squirt in some grease between the gears, and don't worry about coating the gears completely. Once the diff starts working, it will spread itself round quite quickly. Grease up the other bevel gear and pop on the shim. Drop the gear into the diff and work it down so it sits nicely in the middle. Grab the diff cover we forgot at the start. It has 3 posts that fit in the same slots as the star shaft dropped into. It might need a bit of a jiggle to get the bevel gear lined up with the hole. It should end up a millimetre or 2 below the surface. The 3 small self-tappers go in now. Screw them in just far enough that they're not going to fall out. Then do them up a bit at a time, working your way round. They don't need to be done up super tight. As long as the cover's down all the way, it will do just fine. Okay, step 3, the first bit of the gearbox. The kit uses the usual bearings used throughout most Tamiya kits, but like a few of the more recent ones, it needs a pair of carriers to fit them. There must be some advantage to it, but I'm not sure why they don't just have the bearings fit directly into the gearbox. Anyway, those are F6s. We also need D5, 6 and 7. The kit comes with plastic and bronze bushes, but we'll be replacing them with a set of bearings. We're going to need 2 of them for this bit. For the screws, there's an M3x25, an M3x8 and a 12mm self-tapper. The bearings are a fairly tight fit into the carriers, so they should end up pretty much flush to the surface. Pop one of them into D6. It locates itself quite nicely, so there's no alignment to worry about. Next is the diff. Now there's nothing to keep it in position until the drive cups are installed later, so it just sits in there loose for now. Fit the other bearing carrier into the other half of the gearbox and put them together. Check the 2 parts fit perfectly all the way around. It's extremely unlikely with a Tamiya, but sometimes you can find little bits of bad moulding that stop parts fitting perfectly. Now would be a good time to correct it if you do find any problems. If it all fits, take it apart again and grease up the diff gear. A nice load all the way around. It will spread itself out once we start driving, so it doesn't need to be an even coat. Next, the plate goes on with a long screw at the top, short screw on the right, and the self-tapper at the bottom. The M3 screws only thread on the last few millimetres of the screw, so be very careful not to strip the plastic. Do them up a bit at a time and take it slow. Next step, step 4, attaching the rear skid and other miscellaneous gubbins. We've got this little cover, D9, we've got D4, D1, the skid, D11 and 12, these are little cross braces, and D2, which I think is the mount for the optional anti-roll bar. For screws we need 4 15mm self-tappers, 2 M3x10s and an M3x8. There's a couple of bits to keep an eye on in this step. First, D11 fits into a slot in the back of the skid. It needs to be the right way up for the holes to line up. The little tab goes in first so it all keeps itself in place. Second is D12, which fits up inside D2. One side has a slope that fits the shape of the underside of D2. If it sticks up, flip it round and it should be a perfect fit. The side plate fits to the side of the gearbox. It self-locates fairly well. Keep hold of it and pop in the little cover. It will only fit properly one way. If the holes don't line up, swap it round. The 2 M3x10s fit in the cover's holes. Do them up so they won't fall out, but are still loose enough everything can move around. One of the self-tappers goes in just below the cover. Again, leave it loose enough everything can move. Fit the skid and its brace between the plates and install 2 of the self-tappers. Again, leave them nice and loose. Last bit to fit, the anti-roll bar mount, which slots in at the top. Fit the last 2 screws and work your way around, tightening up each screw a bit at a time. There's no need to tighten up the 2 screws on the skid. We'll need to hinge it down when we mount the gearbox to the chassis, so leave it so it's free to move. We'll nip it up when it's all mounted. When it's all tightened up though, we end up with a rather solid unit. Very nice. Step 5, gears. And not surprisingly, we're going to need the remaining gears. The gear cover, which is D8, an M3x10 and an M3x8. The 2 shafts and some bearings. 2 of the big ones and 2 of the small ones. The long gear gets a big bearing in one end and a small bearing in the other, followed by the shaft down the middle. Because we're using bearings, we don't need or want to grease up the shaft. The short gear is the same, one of each bearing and the shaft. You may find you need to press the small bearing home with the wrench as suggested in the manual. It can be a bit fiddly otherwise. Grease up the long gear, it'll get some grease from the differential, but a little bit more won't hurt. Feed it in and press the shaft into the hole. For the short gear, only grease up the small set of teeth. The large part will be running with the aluminium pinion, so it's going to be better off left dry. When both gears are in place, fit the cover. It will drop into place with a bit of a jiggle to get everything nicely lined up. Fit the 8mm screw in the top and the 10mm screw in the bottom. Do them up carefully, it's a machine thread going into plastic after all. And there we have one nice little gearbox with most of the running gear along the outside. A rather interesting design. And that's going to have to do for this week, or I'm not going to get it all edited and uploaded in time. Next time we will finish up the gearbox and by the looks of it have it all fitted to the main chassis. Nice! We'll probably make a start on bag B too. Anyway, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you want to see the next one. Bye guys!